Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to ride out onto plains so vast they swallow horizons, into a story so epic it strains belief. We've asked the question, how does an empire that dwarfed Rome, that made Alexander's conquests look like a regional squabble, just fade from the main stage of history? Why is Mongolia, the land that birthed this colossus, often just a blank space on our mental maps, a synonym for remote or empty? The intro set the stage, the wind is already howling a prelude. But before we get to the Khans, the conquests, the rivers of blood and silk, we need to understand the crucible. We need to feel the land itself, because Mongolia isn't just a backdrop to this story, it's a character, perhaps the most important one. It's the stern, unyielding parent that shaped its children into the hardest people the world had ever seen. Chapter 1. The Cradle of Hardship, where the sky is father and earth is mother. Imagine, if you will, standing in the heart of the Mongolian steppe. Look around. What do you see? Grass. An ocean of grass, stretching to every compass point, rippling like water under a wind that never seems to stop. This isn't the gentle, manicured green of an English park. This is tough, wiry grass, surviving on scant rainfall, baking under a sun that can feel like a blacksmith's forge in summer, and buried under snows so deep in winter they can swallow a man whole. Trees, you'll be looking for a while. They huddle in sparse groves along riverbanks or cling to the northern mountainsides, shy hermits in a land ruled by open space. This lack of wood, of course, had profound consequences. You don't build sprawling wooden cities here or great fleets. You build with what you have: felt, animal hides, ingenuity. Your shelter, the ger, or yurt as many know it, becomes a masterpiece of portable engineering, a dome of felt and latticed wood that can be dismantled and loaded onto a cart or camel in hours. Warm in winter, cool in summer, perfectly adapted to a life on the move. Its circular shape, a mirror of the horizon of the sun of the cycles of life. And the sky. Oh, the sky above Mongolia. It's not just a roof, it's a presence. Unfettered by city lights or pollution, it's a canvas of infinite blue by day, and by night, a mind-boggling splash of stars so bright they feel close enough to touch. This is the realm of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, the supreme deity of the early Mongols. Tengri wasn't a god who lived in a temple. Tengri was the temple, vast and ever-present. Your father. And below, Etugenik, Mother Earth, fertile and nurturing, but also capable of terrible wrath. This relationship with the cosmos wasn't abstract philosophy, it was daily reality. The wind wasn't just weather, it was Tengri's breath, carrying messages, omens, the spirits of ancestors. Now let's talk about the climate, because if the land was a stern parent, the climate was its enforcer. We're talking temperatures that can swing from a blistering plus 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, in the Gobi Desert during summer to a soul-crushing minus 50 degrees Celsius, minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit on the northern steppes in winter. And then there's the Zud. The Zud is a word that still sends shivers down the spine of any Mongolian herder. It's a uniquely Mongolian disaster, a brutal winter phenomenon where a summer drought is followed by heavy snow and extreme cold. The animals, weakened by lack of summer grazing, can't break through the ice-crusted snow to find fodder, and they perish in droves. A bad Zud could wipe out entire herds, and with them, a family's, even a clan's, entire livelihood. Survival wasn't a given, it was a daily, desperate battle. This relentless environment forged the Mongol people. It stripped away the superfluous. It demanded resilience, resourcefulness, and a toughness that's hard for us, in our climate-controlled lives, to truly comprehend. You didn't just survive Mongolia. Mongolia carved you, honed you like a blade on a whetstone. Weakness was a death sentence. Complacency was a fool's game. Every child learned to ride almost before they could walk. Every man, and often woman, was a hunter, an archer, a warrior in waiting. Their senses were preternaturally sharp. They could spot game or enemies miles away across the shimmering plains, read the weather in the subtle shifts of the wind, navigate by stars as easily as we use GPS. Their entire existence revolved around what they called the five snouts, or taven koshumal. Horses, sheep, goats, camels, and cattle, often yaks in the higher regions. These weren't just livestock, they were life itself. The horse star, the Mongolian horse, small, incredibly hardy with legendary stamina, able to survive on almost nothing, pawing through snow for frozen grass. It was more than transport, it was a partner, a weapon, a source of milk, which they fermented into the potent arag, and, in dire straits, food. A Mongol warrior without his horse was like a bird without wings. They were said to be born in the saddle. Sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and most importantly, wool and cashmere for felt and clothing, the very fabric of their homes and warmth. Camels, the Bactrian two-humped kind, were the heavy lifters, crucial for transporting those dismantled gears and supplies across the vast distances, especially through the arid Gobi. Cattle and yaks offered more meat, milk, and muscle. Everything was used, nothing was wasted. Bones were carved into tools or ornaments, sinew used for bowstrings, dung dried for fuel in a treeless land. This was the original nose-to-tail existence, born not of hipster foodie trends, but of brutal necessity. This deep, almost sacred connection to their animals and the land permeated their spiritual beliefs. Tengrism wasn't about elaborate rituals in dedicated buildings. It was lived. Mountains were sacred, springs had spirits, and misfortune was often seen as a disturbance of the natural or spiritual order. An offense against Tengri, or the local spirits of the land, the Gazarin Ezin. Shamans, the Bu or Udgan, female shamans, acted as intermediaries, healers, diviners, reading fortunes in the cracks of scorched sheep shoulder blades, a practice called scapulomancy, or by observing the flight of birds, the patterns of smoke. They weren't priests of a dogma, but rather conduits to the swirling, untamed spiritual forces that animated the Mongol world. So, you see, this land wasn't just a place where the Mongols lived. It was the forge, the anvil, and the hammer that shaped them. It taught them mobility, following the best pastures, escaping harsh weather or stronger enemies. It taught them endurance. It taught them a profound respect for the natural world, even as they struggled against its harshest aspects. And it instilled in them a fierce independence, a suspicion of outsiders, and an unbreakable bond with their kin and their herds. It's a stark, beautiful, and terrifying land. A land that seems to whisper, only the strong survive here. And it was from this cradle of hardship, from these seemingly empty, wind-scoured plains, that a power would arise that would not just survive, but would make the entire known world tremble. The wind was gathering even then, long before the name Genghis Khan was ever spoken. It was picking up the scent of change, of a storm brewing just over the horizon. And the bones of countless generations who had lived and died on this steppe formed the very ground from which that storm would erupt. The silk? The silk was still a distant dream, a whisper from faraway lands, a symbol of the riches that lay beyond the endless grass. For now, it was a world of wind and bone. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Grass. Life before the Great Khan. Now that we've breathed the air of the steppe and felt its bite, let's pan in closer. Before one man bent them to his will, who were these people, these scattered constellations of humanity dotting the immense grasslands? What was life like in those centuries before the name Mongol became a thunderclap? Forget any notion of a unified Mongolian identity back then. The landscape we now call Mongolia, and the vast adjoining territories, was a patchwork quilt of nomadic tribes and confederations, constantly shifting, forming alliances, and just as quickly, breaking them in bloody feuds. Think of it like a Game of Thrones played out on horseback, with fewer castles and a whole lot more windburn. You have the Tatars, a powerful group to the east, whose name, ironically, would later be mistakenly applied by Europeans to the Mongols themselves, as Tatars, often associated with Tartarus, the hell of Greek mythology, a testament to the fear they inspired. There were the Merkits, fierce and often antagonistic to Temujin's fledgling clan. The Naimans to the west, more sophisticated, influenced by the Uyghur culture, some even Nestorian Christians. The Kirates, led by Togrul Khan, who would play a crucial father figure, then rival to the future Genghis. And of course, the Kamag Mongol, Temujin's own people, a relatively minor player in the grand scheme of things at first, but with a lineage that held a certain prestige, tracing back to a mythical blue wolf and a fallow doe. Life was a relentless cycle of survival, punctuated by sudden, brutal violence. The core unit was the family, then the clan, obob, then the lineage, yasin, literally bone, signifying shared ancestry. Your bone determined your loyalties, your allies, your potential enemies. Loyalty within the clan was paramount, but loyalty between clans, that was a far more fluid concept, often bought with gifts, sealed with marriage alliances, which were just as frequently broken, or shattered by perceived insults, or the eternal struggle for resources, pastureland, water sources, and livestock. Raiding was endemic. It wasn't just about plunder, it was about honor, revenge, and demonstrating strength. A stolen horse, a slight against a kinsman, an encroachment on grazing lands. Any of these could trigger a swift, merciless raid. Warriors would sweep down on an enemy camp, often at dawn, an explosion of hooves and war cries. Captives, especially women and children, were taken, herds driven off. It was a harsh, unforgiving world where showing weakness was an invitation to disaster. The vanquished have no rights was an unspoken rule. Yet, amidst this constant friction, there were powerful bonds that could transcend clan loyalties. One was the Anda blood brotherhood. This wasn't a casual friendship. Two men would become Anda by a solemn ritual, sometimes involving the mixing of blood, swearing eternal loyalty to each other, closer than even biological brothers. An Anda was sworn to avenge his counterpart, to support him in any feud, to share his last piece of meat. Genghis Khan himself would forge crucial Anda relationships, most famously and tragically with Jamuka. Another key relationship was that of the Noka companion. A Noka was a warrior who voluntarily pledged his allegiance to a leader, not based on kinship, but on the leader's charisma, prowess, and ability to provide for his followers. These Nokad, plural, formed the core of a chieftain's warband, his most trusted guards and lieutenants. It was a system that allowed ambitious leaders to attract talent from outside their own clan, a precursor to the meritocracy Genghis Khan would later formalize. So, what was daily life like in a ger pitched somewhere on that endless grass? The ger itself, as we mentioned, was a marvel of nomadic architecture. Always facing south or southeast, its doorway was a threshold between the domestic sphere and the vast, often hostile wilderness. Inside, it was smoky from the central fire, fueled by dried dung, argol, but surprisingly snug. Space was strictly organized. The men's side, the women's side, the place of honor opposite the door, usually for the eldest or a guest. The diet was robust and largely carnivorous and dairy-based. Lots of mutton, boiled or roasted, goat. Occasionally horse meat, especially for feasts or in times of war. Game, when they could get it, marmots, a steppe delicacy, though sometimes carriers of plague, wild deer, gazelles. Vegetables and grains were scarce, usually obtained through trade with sedentary peoples on the fringes of the steppe, or from the few river valleys where limited cultivation was possible. What they lacked in greens, they made up for in dairy. Milk from mares, cows, goats, sheep, camels, yaks, consumed fresh, or more often, processed into a bewildering array of products. Arag, the famous fermented mare's milk, mildly alcoholic and packed with vitamins. Arul, dried curds, hard as rocks, that could last for months, perfect for travel, various cheeses, yogurts, and butter. This diet, high in protein and fat, provided the energy needed for a physically demanding life in a cold climate. Think of it as the original Atkins diet, but born of necessity, not choice. Women in pre-imperial Mongol society, while living in a patriarchal structure, held a degree of agency and respect that often surprised outsiders from more restrictive sedentary cultures. They managed the household, which was no small feat, milking the animals, preparing food, making clothing from skins and felt, raising children, and crucially, dismantling and erecting the ger during migrations. They could inherit property, and widows often managed their late husbands' herds and households. They weren't veiled or secluded. They rode horses, sometimes even participated in hunts or warfare, and their counsel was often sought by their husbands. Adultery, however, was severely punished for both men and women, as it threatened the integrity of the family and clan unit. Children learned the ways of the steppe from infancy. Boys were taught to ride and shoot a bow from a very young age. By their early teens, they were expected to be proficient hunters and warriors. Girls learned the complex skills of managing a nomadic household. Play often mimicked adult activities: wrestling, horse racing, archery contests. Life was short, often brutal, and childhood was not a period of extended innocence. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the needs of the herds. Constant movement, from summer pastures in the north or higher altitudes to winter camps in more sheltered valleys. This wasn't aimless wandering, it was a carefully planned rotation based on generations of accumulated knowledge about where the best grass and water could be found at different times of the year. Each blade of grass, each drop of water was precious. Spiritually, as we touched upon, Tengrism and shamanism were dominant. The world was alive with spirits. Ancestors were venerated, their spirits believed to watch over the living. Certain mountains, rivers, and old trees were considered sacred, imbued with power. Before a hunt, a journey, or a battle, offerings would be made, shamans consulted. Omens were everywhere if you knew how to read them. The cry of a particular bird, the way the smoke rose from the fire, a dream, all could hold meaning. This was the world into which Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was born around 1162. A world of breathtaking beauty and terrifying harshness. A world of fierce loyalties and even fiercer vendettas. A world where survival was a daily struggle and power was fleeting, always contested. There were no grand cities, no monumental texts being written, no empires being proclaimed, not yet. Just the endless grass, the sighing wind carrying the echoes of countless small drummers, the scent of wood smoke from scattered gers, and the distant thunder of hooves. It was a society balanced on a knife edge, a volatile mixture of clans and ambitions. All it needed was a spark to ignite the dry grass of the steppe and set it ablaze. And that spark was about to be struck. Chapter 3. A Spark in the Wilderness. The Forging of Temujin. Alright, let's zoom in from the wide shot of tribal life to a single flickering campfire, sometime around the mid-12th century. Here, in the rugged Khenti mountains of northeastern Mongolia, near the Onon River, a boy named Temujin was born. His birth, like much of his early life, is shrouded in legend, the kind of stories that get better with every telling around a crackling fire. One tale says he was born clutching a blood clot the size of a knuckle bone in his right fist, an omen, the shamans whispered, of a future ruler, a man destined to spill blood and hold power. Whether true or not, it set a dramatic tone for what was to come. Temujin wasn't born into supreme power. His father, Yesgai Bata, Yesgai the Valiant, was a chieftain of the Borjigin clan, part of the larger Kamek Mongol Confederation. Yesgai had ambition. He'd made a name for himself, even kidnapped Temujin's mother, Hedlin, from her Merkit husband, a common enough practice, but one that sowed seeds of a bitter blood feud that would haunt Temujin later. Yesgai was trying to build alliances to elevate the standing of the Kamek Mongols. He even managed to get himself declared Khan by a small assembly of followers, a title that, at this point, was more aspirational than actual. But the steppe, as we know, is a fickle mistress. When Temujin was just a boy, perhaps 9 years old, Yesgai was taking him to the Ongarit tribe, Helan's people, to find a bride for his son. This was standard practice, cementing alliances through marriage. He found a suitable girl, bought, and as was custom, left Temujin to live with her family for a few years to earn his bride. On his way home, Yesgai, thirsty and trusting, shared a meal with a group of Tatars, old enemies. They recognized him. The Tatars, remembering past grievances, secretly poisoned his food. Yesgai made it back to his camp just barely and died. And just like that, Temujin's world shattered. With Yesgai gone, his followers, those fair-weather friends so common in tribal politics, melted away like snow in the spring sun. The deep water is so gahajwer, the strong stone is broken, they reportedly said, abandoning Yesgai's widows and young children. Helan, a woman of incredible fortitude, was left with Temujin, his younger brothers, a stepbrother, and a handful of loyal retainers to fend for themselves in a hostile world. They were outcasts, driven from their clan's protection, reduced to surviving on wild roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. The shame of it, the bitterness, must have been a fire in young Temujin's belly. These were the years that forged him. The wilderness became his harsh schoolmaster. He learned to hunt, to track, to endure hunger and cold. He learned the brutal calculus of survival. There's a famous story from this period that speaks volumes about his hardening character. He had a dispute with his older half-brother, Beta, over a fish Temujin had caught, or a lark Beta had shot. Food was scarce, tensions high. Temujin, with his full brother Kesar, ambushed Beta and killed him with arrows. When Helen confronted him, furious at this kinslaying, Temujin's justification was stark. Beta was a threat, a rival. It was a chilling glimpse of the ruthlessness that would later define him, the idea that any threat to his security, his leadership, must be eliminated. The steppe had no room for sentimentality when your life was on the line. Then came another blow. The Taiched, rival relatives who had abandoned them, feared that Temujin, as Yesgai's son, might one day seek revenge or rally support. So they hunted him down. Temujin was captured, humiliated, forced to wear a wooden kang, a heavy collar, and paraded as a prisoner. This was the ultimate degradation for a proud Mongol. But even in captivity, Temujin's spirit wasn't broken. He watched, he waited. And one night, during a feast when his captors were drunk and lax, he saw his chance. He knocked out his guard with the kang and fled, hiding in the Onan River with only his nostrils above water until the searchers gave up. He was aided in his escape by Sorgan Shara, a man from a subservient clan who risked his own life to help him, an act of loyalty Temujin would never forget, later rewarding Sorgan Shara and his family handsomely. This experience taught him the value of loyalty from unexpected quarters and the bitter taste of betrayal from his own kin. Slowly, painstakingly, Temujin began to gather a following. Not through inherited power, he had none left, but through sheer force of will, charisma, and a growing reputation for courage and cunning. He reclaimed his promised bride, the steadfast But, who would become his most trusted advisor and the mother of his imperial heirs. But their reunion was short-lived. The Merkits, remembering the old insult of Helan's abduction decades earlier, launched a surprise raid on Temujin's small camp. Temujin himself barely escaped, but Bort was captured. This was a pivotal moment. For a Mongol leader, losing his wife to enemies was a profound dishonor. But Temujin didn't just mourn, he acted. He knew he was too weak to take on the Merkits alone. So he swallowed his pride and sought help. He went to Togrul Khan of the Karaits, his father's old Anda. Togrul, perhaps seeing a spark of Yesgai in the young man, or perhaps seeing a useful pawn, agreed to help. Temujin also reached out to another rising young chieftain, Jamuka of the Jadaran clan, a childhood friend with whom he had sworn Anda. Together, the three forces crushed the Merkits. Bert was rescued. Temujin's honor was restored, his reputation enhanced. He had faced his first major test as a leader, and with crucial help, had triumphed. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka, the two blood brothers, campaigned together, their forces combined. They were like two young wolves, powerful and ambitious. But their personalities, their visions of leadership, were fundamentally different. Jamuka favored the traditional aristocratic structure, where lineage and noble birth determined status. Temujin, perhaps because of his own harsh experiences as an outcast, was increasingly drawn to a merit-based system, valuing loyalty and ability over bloodlines. The cracks began to show. The story goes that one day, while migrating, Jamuka suggested they camp near the mountains, good for horsemen, the traditional elite, while Temujin suggested camping near the river, better for the common herders and their flocks. A seemingly small disagreement, but symbolic of their diverging paths. That night, many of Jamuka's followers, commoners who felt more affinity with Temujin's inclusive style, secretly switched their allegiance and joined Temujin's camp. The split was inevitable. The two Anda, once inseparable, became bitter rivals, their competition escalating into open warfare that would tear the Mongol tribes apart for years. The path to unifying the Mongols was not a straight line. It was a brutal, messy, decade-spanning struggle. Temujin suffered defeats that almost broke him. He was forced to flee, to hide, to regroup, but each time he learned who to trust, who to eliminate. He learned to be patient, to strike when the moment was right. He was a master of psychological warfare even then, able to inspire fanatical loyalty in his followers and sow terror in his enemies. He rewarded loyalty lavishly, but punished betrayal with pitiless severity. He began to absorb defeated tribes into his own, not just enslaving them or driving them off, the common practice, but integrating their warriors into his army, their people into his growing nation, provided they swore fealty to him. This was revolutionary. He was breaking down old tribal structures and forging something new, a super-tribal identity loyal to him alone. His final major rival among the Mongols was Jamuka himself. Their conflict was long and bitter, marked by betrayals and shifting alliances. In one famous battle, Jamuka defeated Temujin and, in a shockingly cruel act designed to terrorize Temujin's remaining followers, boiled 70 young male captives alive in cauldrons. This barbarity backfired. Many Mongols, disgusted by Jamuka's cruelty and his adherence to aristocratic privilege, flocked to Temujin's banner, seeing him as a stronger, more just leader. The final showdown came. Jamuka, his support dwindling, was eventually betrayed by his own men and delivered to Temujin. What happened next is a testament to the complex, often contradictory nature of these steppe warlords. Temujin, it's said, was reluctant to execute his former anda. He offered Jamuka reconciliation, a high position in his new order. But Jamuka, proud to the end, refused. He reportedly asked for a noble death, one without the shedding of blood, as was custom for royalty, by having his back broken. He argued that just as there could only be one sun in the sky, there could only be one Khan on the steppe. Temujin, with a heavy heart, granted his request. The death of Jamuka, his blood brother and greatest rival, marked the end of serious opposition to Temujin's ascendancy within the Mongol tribes. He had also systematically defeated the Tatars, avenging his father, and in the process, nearly exterminating them as a distinct tribal entity, absorbing their remnants. The Karets, after Togrul Khan, swayed by his jealous son, turned on Temujin and the Naimans. The boy who clutched a blood clot, the outcast who survived en route, the captive in the Kang, had, through unimaginable hardship, relentless will, and brilliant, brutal strategy, climbed the slippery ladder of steppe politics. He stood now on the cusp of something unprecedented. The scattered, warring tribes of Mongolia were about to be forged into a single, terrifyingly effective weapon. The spark had indeed become a wildfire. Chapter 4. The Nation Forged in Fire, the Great Kurultai and the Yasa. The year is 1206. Picture this. The banks of the Onan River, the very same river near which Temujin was born and later hid from his enemies. But now, the scene is vastly different. No more a fugitive scrabbling for survival. Instead, a vast encampment, a sea of gurs, tens of thousands of warriors, chieftains, families, herds. This is the culmination of decades of bloodshed, betrayal, and unbreakable will. This is the Great Kurultai, the grand assembly of Mongol leaders. And at its center, under a white banner adorned with 9 yak tails, a symbol of supreme command, stands Temujin. He's in his mid-40s now. Forged in the crucible of the steppe, his face is likely a roadmap of his life, weathered by wind and sun, etched with the lines of hardship and countless campaigns. His eyes, they say, were like a falcon's, missing nothing. Here, at this momentous gathering, the assembled nobles, the leaders of all the tribes he has conquered and unified, formally acknowledge him as their supreme ruler. He is given a new title, one that will echo through history, striking fear and awe in equal measure: Genghis Khan. The meaning of Genghis Khan or Chinggis Khan is still debated by scholars. Oceanic ruler, universal ruler, strong ruler, righteous ruler, interpretations vary. But whatever its precise linguistic origin, its impact was clear. This was no mere tribal chieftain. This was the supreme sovereign of all the peoples who live in felt-tented yurts, the emperor of the newly birthed Mongol nation. The old tribal names, Tatar, Karait, Naiman, Merkit, were, in theory, to be suppressed. From now on, they were all Mongols, subjects of the Great Khan. a nation forged not from shared soil in the way a settled kingdom was, but from shared allegiance to one man and his vision. This Kurultay wasn't just a coronation, it was the formal birth of an empire. And an empire needs more than just a strong leader. It needs laws, structure, a way to organize itself. Genghis Khan, despite being illiterate himself, a common trait among nomadic chieftains of the era, understood this profoundly. He set about creating the framework for his new state, and the cornerstone of this was the yasa or zasag, meaning decree or order. Now, the yasa is one of history's great enigmas. No complete, original written version has ever been found. We know of it mostly through secondary sources, accounts by Persian historians, European travelers, and Chinese officials who interacted with the Mongols. It was likely a combination of traditional steppe customs, Genghis Khan's own decrees, and pragmatic solutions to the challenges of ruling a vast, diverse, and mobile population. It was probably recorded, at least in part, using the Uyghur script, which Genghis Khan ordered adapted for the Mongolian language, a crucial step in creating a sense of national identity and administrative cohesion. Imagine that, a nomadic empire, recognizing the power of the written word for governance. So, what was in this largely unwritten but iron-enforced law code? First and foremost, absolute loyalty to the Khan. Disobedience, rebellion, or any form of treachery against Genghis Khan or his designated successors was punishable by death. This was the bedrock. Second, and quite revolutionary for its time and place, meritocracy. Genghis Khan had seen firsthand how tribal aristocracy and nepotism, like Chamuka's system, bred division and weakness. Under the yasa, promotion, especially in the military and administration, was to be based on skill, loyalty, and achievement, not on noble birth. His most famous generals like Subutai and Jeeb, the Arrow, rose from humble origins. This unleashed a torrent of talent and fierce devotion. Third, there was a surprising degree of religious tolerance. The yasa decreed that all religions were to be respected and their clergy exempted from taxes and public service. This wasn't necessarily from a place of enlightened modern liberalism, but rather shrewd pragmatism. Genghis Khan recognized that his burgeoning empire would encompass peoples of many faiths. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, Nestorians were quite prevalent in Central Asia, shamanists like himself. Persecuting them would only stir up unnecessary trouble. Better to let them pray to their gods in peace, as long as they obeyed the Khan. He himself, while adhering to Tengrism, consulted with holy men of various faiths, perhaps seeking wisdom or simply keeping an eye on potential sources of influence. Fourth, the yasa was famously harsh on certain crimes. Theft, especially of livestock, the lifeblood of the steppe, was often punishable by death. Adultery was a capital offense for both men and women. Lying, witchcraft, if used maliciously, and cowardice in battle were also severely dealt with. The goal was to create order, discipline, and a sense of security within his domain. If you lived under the Khan's peace, you lived under his strict rules. Fifth, it laid down regulations for military organization. The entire Mongol society was decimalized for military purposes. Units of 10 Aben, 100 Zun, 1,000 Minkan, and 10,000 Tumen. Each unit was responsible for its members. If one man deserted, his entire unit might be punished. This fostered incredible cohesion and discipline. Sons followed their fathers into the same units. This was not just an army, it was the nation mobilized. Sixth, it emphasized unity among Mongols. Intertribal raiding and kidnapping, the scourge of the pre-Genghis era, were forbidden. Blood feuds were to be settled by the Khan or his designated judges, not by endless cycles of revenge. He was trying to stamp out the very behaviors that had kept the steppe tribes weak and divided for centuries. There were also laws concerning hunts, which were massive military training exercises, the distribution of plunder, hospitality, and even environmental protection. For instance, forbidding urination or washing clothes directly in rivers or lakes, perhaps out of a shamanistic respect for water spirits or a practical understanding of hygiene in a mobile society. The yasa wasn't just a list of thou shalt nots. It was an attempt to create a new social contract for the Mongol people. It aimed to transform them from a collection of feuding pastoralists into a unified, disciplined, and expansionist power. And it worked with terrifying efficiency. The enforcement was brutal and swift. There was little room for appeal. Fear of the Yasa and of the Khan's retribution became a powerful tool of social control. Think about the sheer audacity of it. A leader emerging from one of the most fragmented and remote regions on Earth not only conquers his rivals, but then imposes a unified legal and social structure upon them, effectively creating a nation from scratch. He recognized that military might alone wasn't enough to hold his creation together. He needed a shared identity, shared laws, shared purpose. The adoption of the Woga script was another masterstroke. Before this, the Mongols had no written language of their own. By borrowing and adapting the script, they could now record laws, keep chronicles, like the secret history of the Mongols, our most important native source on Genghis Khan's life, written shortly after his death, and conduct administration across vast distances. The word, the decree, could now travel almost as fast as the horseman. The Great Kurultai of 1206 wasn't an end, it was a beginning. It was the moment the Mongol arrow was knocked, the bowstring drawn taut. The nation had been forged, tempered in the fires of internal conflict, and hammered into shape by the will of Genghis Khan and the laws of his Yasa. The winds that had once merely scattered the dust of the steppe were now being gathered into a focused storm, ready to be unleashed upon the wider world. And the world, largely ignorant of these momentous events unfolding in the remote heart of Asia, had no idea what was about to hit it. The silk-laden cities, the ancient empires, the settled civilizations beyond the grasslands, were living on borrowed time. Chapter 5. The Hooves of God, the Mongol Art of War. So Genghis Khan has his title, his unified nation, and his Yasa. The engine of empire is built. Now, how did this engine run? How did a relatively small population from the remote steppes conquer more territory in 25 years than the Romans did in 400? The answer lies in the Mongol art of war, a terrifyingly effective combination of lifelong training, revolutionary tactics, psychological terror, and unparalleled mobility. It wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature. First, let's talk about the Mongol warrior. This wasn't a conscript dragged from a farm for a seasonal campaign. This was a man, and sometimes woman, though less on the front lines of major invasions, who had practically been born in the saddle. From the age of 3 or 4, Mongol children learned to ride. Their games were mock battles, archery contests, wrestling. Hunting, especially the great annual winter hunt called the Nurj, was a massive military exercise in disguise, involving thousands of riders in vast encirclements, honing skills of coordination, tracking, and killing. Every adult male under a certain age, often up to 60, was considered a soldier liable for service. There was no distinction between civilian and military life. The herder was the warrior. His daily tools, the horse, the bow, were also his weapons of war. And what weapons? The star of the show was the Mongol composite bow. This wasn't some simple wooden self-bow. It was a sophisticated piece of engineering, made from laminated horn, wood, and sinew bound with animal glue. It was relatively short, perfect for use from horseback, but incredibly powerful, with a pull weight often exceeding 100 pounds, sometimes up to 160 pounds. Its range and penetrating power outmatched most contemporary bows. Mongol archers could shoot accurately at full gallop, turning in the saddle to fire backwards, the famous Parthian shot, but perfected by the Mongols. They carried multiple quivers with different types of arrows. Heavy armor-piercing arrows, lighter long-range arrows, whistling signal arrows for communication, even incendiary arrows. A volley from 1,000 Mongol horse archers was like a sudden deadly hailstorm. Then there was the horse. We've already sung its praises. The Mongolian pony, small, shaggy, seemingly tireless, able to survive on minimal grazing, and incredibly agile. Each warrior typically had a string of 3 to 5 horses. This meant they could switch to a fresh mount frequently, allowing for incredible speed and endurance on campaign. They could cover vast distances at a pace that astounded their enemies, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. Armies of sedentary empires, tied to slow-moving infantry and cumbersome supply wagons, were often caught completely off guard. The Mongols were their supply train. To a large extent, they could drink mare's milk, and if necessary, bleed their horses for sustenance, a small incision in a vein, then sealed or eat them. But it wasn't just about good archers and hardy horses. It was their tactics that truly bewildered and terrified their foes. Fiend retreat, the Mangudai tactic. This was a classic. Mongol horse archers would harass the enemy, shower them with arrows, and then pretend to break and flee. Less disciplined enemies, eager for victory, would often break ranks and pursue. This was exactly what the Mongols wanted. They would lead the pursuers into a carefully prepared ambush, where fresh Mongol heavy cavalry or other hidden units would suddenly appear on the flanks and rear, annihilating the disorganized enemy. They played on their opponent's psychology, their arrogance, their desire for a quick win. Encirclement, the Lake or the Mongols were masters of maneuver. Their armies, often divided into multiple wings, could spread out over vast distances, like a net, then converge to surround an enemy force, cutting off escape routes, and peppering them with arrows from all sides until they broke. Psychological warfare. Genghis Khan understood that fear was as potent a weapon as any arrow. Before attacking a major city or region, he would often offer terms: submit, pay tribute, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will face utter annihilation. And he backed up these threats with terrifying consistency. If a city resisted and was then taken, the Mongols often engaged in wholesale slaughter. Not always out of pure bloodlust, though that certainly occurred, but as a deliberate policy. Tales of pyramids of skulls, of entire populations massacred, would spread like wildfire, paralyzing other potential enemies with terror. Sometimes they would spare a few survivors to carry the news of the horror, ensuring the next city thought twice about resisting. They would use captured civilians as human shields in sieges, or force them to fill moats and undermine walls. Brutal? Absolutely. Effective? Devastatingly so. Intelligence and reconnaissance. The Mongols were meticulous planners. They had an incredible network of spies and scouts, the Karu, constantly gathering information about enemy territory, troop strengths, political situations, and even the personalities of opposing commanders. They knew the terrain, the roads, the water sources, often better than the defenders. Before any major campaign, Genghis Khan would gather his generals, pore over maps, often just sketches in the sand, but effective nonetheless, and plan meticulously. Swift communication. The Yam system, which we'll touch on more with the Pax Mongolica, was not just for trade and envoys, it was a vital military tool. Relay riders on fresh horses could carry messages at incredible speeds across the empire, allowing for coordination of vast armies separated by hundreds, even thousands of miles. Orders from the Khan could reach distant commanders with astonishing rapidity. Discipline and cohesion. The decimal system of organization, combined with the harsh discipline of the Yasta, created armies that were incredibly responsive to orders. Units moved with precision, executed complex maneuvers flawlessly. Cowardice was unthinkable, as it brought shame and often death not just to the individual, but potentially to his entire unit. Now, you might be thinking, okay, great on the open steppe, but what about fortified cities? Surely nomads would struggle against high walls. And initially, that was true. Early Mongols were not siege warfare experts. But here's another hallmark of their genius: adaptability. They learned, quickly. When they conquered peoples who were experts in siegecraft, like the Chinese, the Khitans, the Persians, they didn't just slaughter all the engineers. They recruited them. Captured engineers, artisans, and technicians were forced into Mongol service, bringing with them knowledge of siege towers, trebuchets, catapults, battering rams, even gunpowder weapons, which the Mongols would later help spread. Suddenly, Mongol armies weren't just cavalry forces, they were equipped with sophisticated siege trains. No wall was safe. Cities that had withstood sieges for months or years against other enemies found themselves falling to the Mongols in weeks or even days. And logistics. While traditional armies lugged enormous supply trains, the Mongols, as we said, largely lived off the land and their herds. Each warrior carried what he needed: his weapons, a cooking pot, spare bowstrings, a sharpening stone, a needle and thread, and crucially, borts. Borts was dried meat, usually beef or horse, pounded into a powder and packed into a bladder. A small amount mixed with hot water made a nourishing broth. It was lightweight, calorie-dense, and could last for months. This, combined with their ability to forage and requisition from conquered territories, often ruthlessly, gave them a logistical freedom the enemies could only dream of. Think of the Mongol army as a living storm. The light cavalry, the horse archers, were the wind and the rain, scouting, harassing, probing for weaknesses. The heavy cavalry, more armored, wielding lances and sabers, were the lightning strike, delivering the decisive blow once the enemy was disorganized and terrified. And the whole thing was guided by a central intelligence, a will of iron, Genghis Khan and his brilliant, often ruthlessly promoted, generals like Subutai, Jabe, and Mukali. These weren't just thugs on horseback. They were military geniuses, students of war who innovated and adapted constantly. The sound that preceded a Mongol attack wasn't just the thunder of hooves. It was often an eerie silence or the unsettling thrum of whistling arrows designed to create panic. Then the sudden, overwhelming onslaught from multiple directions. It's no wonder many contemporary chroniclers described them as a divine punishment, the wrath of God, or the hooves of God. To those who faced them, it must have seemed like the end of the world. An empire built on wind and bone now possessed an army that moved like the wind and left behind little but bones. The silk would come later as the spoils of conquests made possible by this terrifyingly efficient war machine. Chapter 6, Where the Roads Met. The Pax Mongolica and the Silk Road Reimagined. It's a stunning paradox, isn't it? An empire forged in some of the most brutal warfare the world had ever seen, an empire that waded through rivers of blood to achieve its aims, then turns around and presides over a period of unprecedented peace, stability, and interconnectedness across a vast swath of the Eurasian continent. This era, roughly from the mid-13th to the mid-14th century, is known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, and it's one of the most fascinating and often overlooked legacies of this empire of wind and bones. Now, let's be clear. This peace was bought at an astronomical price. The initial Mongol conquests were devastating. Cities were razed, populations massacred, farmlands laid waste. The fear was real. But once a region was subdued, once it was incorporated into the Mongol domain and the Khan's authority was unchallenged, a different reality often set in. The Mongols, for all their ferocity in war, were surprisingly pragmatic rulers. They weren't interested in ideological conversion, mostly, or imposing their nomadic lifestyle on settled agricultural societies. What they wanted was tribute, trade, and order. Disorder was bad for business, bad for collecting taxes, and bad for the stability of their vast, multi-ethnic empire. And the key to this order, the artery that pulsed with life during the Pax Mongolica, was the Silk Road. Or rather, the Silk Roads, a network of ancient trade routes that had connected east and west for centuries. Under Mongol rule, these routes weren't just revived, they were supercharged. Why? Firstly, unification and security. For the first time, a single power controlled almost the entire length of the Silk Road, from China to the borders of Europe and deep into Persia. Before the Mongols, a merchant traveling these routes would have had to pass through numerous kingdoms, pay countless tolls and taxes, and face constant threats from bandits and warring states. Under the Khans, the roads were made safe. Genghis Khan and his successors, particularly Ogidi, understood the value of trade. The Yasa itself had provisions protecting merchants and envoys. The saying often attributed to this period was that a maiden bearing a nugget of gold on her head could wander safely from one end of the empire to the other. While perhaps an exaggeration, it speaks to the remarkable level of security achieved. Robbing a merchant on a Mongol-controlled road wasn't just theft, it was an offense against the Khan, and punishment was swift and severe. Secondly, the yam system. We touched on this as a military tool, but it was equally, if not more, vital for trade and communication. This was an incredibly efficient imperial postal relay system, a sort of Pony Express on an intercontinental scale. Well-stocked relay stations were established roughly every 25 to 30 miles along major routes. At these stations, official riders could obtain fresh horses, food, and lodging, allowing them to carry messages, official decrees, and even important travelers, like Marco Polo, across the empire at astonishing speeds. For merchants, while they might not have used the official yam horses themselves, those were for imperial business. The system ensured that the roads were maintained, patrolled, and that news, and therefore market information, traveled fast. It greased the wheels of commerce like never before. Thirdly, the Mongol attitude towards merchants. Unlike some aristocratic societies that looked down on trade, the Mongols generally valued merchants. They saw them as sources of valuable goods, information, and revenue, through taxes, of course. They encouraged traders, granted them privileges, and even used them as envoys and intelligence gatherers. The autark system, for example, involved Mongol nobles or the Khan himself investing in merchant caravans, essentially forming business partnerships. This provided capital for long-distance trade and shared the risks and profits. So, what flowed along these revitalized silk roads during the Pax Mongolica? More than just silk, though that remained a prime luxury. Goods, spices from India and the Spice Islands, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, precious stones, perfumes, medicines, paper and printing technology from China, ceramics, textiles, finished metal goods, furs from the north, horses, slaves. A dark but undeniable part of the trade. Europe, in turn, sent wool, linen, silver, and other raw materials eastward. It was a truly globalized marketplace for its time. Ideas and technologies. This is where the Pax Mongolica had perhaps its most profound, long-lasting impact. Asterisk printing. Chinese woodblock printing technology traveled westward, eventually influencing Gutenberg. Asterisk gunpowder. Another Chinese invention, its military applications were further developed and spread by the Mongols, fundamentally changing warfare worldwide. Asterisk the compass. While known in China earlier, its use in navigation became more widespread. Asterisk medicine and science. Persian astronomical knowledge, mathematics, like algebra, and medical practices moved east, while Chinese medical knowledge, like pulse diagnosis, and pharmacology moved west. There was a significant cross-pollination of ideas. Kublai Khan, for instance, established an observatory in his capital Dadu, Beijing, staffed by Muslim astronomers. Asterisk cuisine, foods and cooking techniques migrated. Noodles from China might have influenced Italian pasta, though that's a debated topic. Sugar refining, distillation techniques. People and religions. The roads weren't just for goods, they were for people. Asterisk travelers and envoys. This was the age of the great long-distance travelers. Marco Polo and his family's journey to the court of Kublai Khan is the most famous, but there were many others. European friars like William of Rubruck and Giovanni de Pien del Carpane traveled to the Mongol courts as papal envoys, leaving invaluable accounts. Conversely, figures like Rabban Bar Soma, an Nestorian Christian monk born near Beijing, traveled from the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia to Europe, meeting kings and the Pope. Imagine that reverse journey. Asterisk missionaries. Religious ideas flowed freely. Buddhism spread from Tibet and Central Asia into China and Mongolia. Islam consolidated its hold in Persia and Central Asia and spread further. Nestorian Christianity, already present, had a significant following among some Mongol tribes and in parts of the empire. Catholic missionaries ventured east. This religious tolerance, for the most part, created a vibrant cosmopolitan atmosphere in many parts of the Mongol world. Asterisk artisans and craftsmen. The Mongols, great appreciators of craftsmanship, even if they weren't producing much of it themselves initially, often forcibly relocated skilled artisans from conquered lands to their capitals, like Karakoram or later Dadu. This created centers where different artistic traditions could meet and meld, leading to new hybrid styles in ceramics, textiles, and metalwork. It's important not to romanticize the Pax Mongolica too much. It was still an empire built on conquest, and life for many subject peoples remained harsh. Taxes could be heavy, Mongol overlords often arrogant. And there was a devastating, unintended consequence of this increased interconnectedness: disease. The Black Death, the bubonic plague that would decimate Europe in the mid-14th century, is widely believed to have originated in the steppes of Central Asia and spread rapidly along these very same Mongol-protected trade routes, carried by fleas on rats in merchant caravans. The peace that facilitated the flow of silk and spices also tragically, facilitated the flow of pestilence. Nevertheless, the Pax Mongolica represents a unique period in world history. For roughly a century, a single empire fostered a level of transcontinental exchange that would not be seen again until the rise of European maritime empires centuries later. It literally redrew the map of the known world, not just politically, but economically and culturally. The Empire of Wind had, paradoxically, created the conditions for the greatest movement of goods, ideas, and people the world had yet seen. The bones of the conquered had become the foundation for a new global network. And silk, once a distant luxury, now flowed more freely than ever, a symbol of this interconnected, Mongol-dominated world. It was a brief, shiny moment when the roads of the world truly met, under the watchful, often brutal, gaze of the Khans. Chapter 7. Beyond the endless grass. Conquests that redrew the world. With the Mongol nation unified and the war machine primed, Genghis Khan didn't sit back and admire his handiwork on the steppes. The Kurultai of 1206 wasn't a retirement party, it was a launch party. The oceanic ruler was ready to spill over the banks of his homeland and engulf the world. The next 2 decades, and the decades following his death under his sons and grandsons, would see a whirlwind of conquests so vast, so swift, and so devastating that they permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of Asia and Europe. First, let's understand the targets. To the south and east of Mongolia lay powerful, wealthy, sedentary civilizations. The Xia Kingdom, Western Xia, ruled by the Tangut people, controlled a crucial section of the Silk Road in what is now northwestern China. They were a thorn in Genghis Khan's side, a potential threat to his flank. Campaigns against Xia began even before the 1206 Kurultai and continued intermittently. The Tanguts were tough, their cities well fortified, their lands a mixture of desert and irrigated oases. It was here the Mongols began to seriously learn siege warfare. The Xia were eventually and brutally crushed, ceasing to exist as an independent entity shortly after Genghis Khan's own death in 1227. Some say his final command was their utter annihilation. Then there was the mighty Jin dynasty of northern China, ruled by the Jurchens. This was a far greater prize. The Jin controlled vast agricultural lands, populous cities, and immense wealth. They had long treated the steppe nomads as troublesome barbarians, even building fortifications, precursors to parts of the Great Wall, to keep them out. For Genghis Khan, conquering the Jin was not just about plunder, it was about reversing this dynamic, about asserting Mongol dominance. The Jin campaigns were long and incredibly brutal, lasting for over 2 decades, from around 1211 to 1234, completed under Ogidi Khan. The Mongols faced massive Jin armies, sophisticated fortifications, and unfamiliar terrain. But they adapted. They learned to take cities, to counter Jin tactics. They besieged and captured the Jin capital of Zhongdu, near modern Beijing, in 1215. A horrific sack that left the city burning for a month. The stories of the slaughter, the pyramids of bones, the streets greasy with human fat, cemented the Mongols' terrifying reputation. But perhaps the most fateful, and in some ways most shocking, of Genghis Khan's campaigns was against the Khwarezmian Empire. This was a vast Muslim empire stretching across Persia, Transoxiana, modern Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan. Initially, Genghis Khan seemed interested in trade and diplomatic relations with the Khwarezmians. He sent a large trade caravan laden with goods to their lands. But the governor of the Khwarezmian city of Otrar, Inalchik, perhaps out of greed or suspicion, he accused them of being spies, foolishly seized the caravan and had the merchants executed. A colossal diplomatic blunder. Genghis Khan, furious, sent envoys to the Khwarezmian Shah, Muhammad Ur, demanding that Inalchik be handed over for punishment. The Shah, arrogant and overconfident in his empire's strength, made an even bigger mistake. He killed some of the envoys and shaved the beards of others, a grave insult. That was it. The die was cast. Genghis Khan, legend says, climbed a mountain, prayed to Tengri for 3 days, and then unleashed the full fury of the Mongol horde upon the Khwarezmian Empire, 1219 to 1221. This campaign was a masterpiece of military strategy and utter ruthlessness. The Mongols didn't just attack from one direction. Genghis Khan, with his main force, and his brilliant generals Jebe and Subutai leading other columns, executed a multi-pronged invasion that bewildered the Khwarezmians. They crossed the supposedly impassable Kizilkum Desert to appear unexpectedly in the Khwarezmian heartland. Cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, ancient centers of Islamic civilization, learning, and art, were besieged, captured, and utterly devastated. Eyewitness accounts speak of unimaginable slaughter, libraries burned, irrigation systems destroyed, turning fertile lands back into desert for generations. Shah Muhammad Aid fled, pursued relentlessly by Jebe and Subutai, eventually dying a broken man on an island in the Caspian Sea. His son, the courageous Jalal el-Din, fought on, but the empire was shattered. Inalchuk, the governor who started it all. He was reportedly captured, and Genghis Khan had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. A grim poetic justice. It was during this Khwarezmian campaign that Jebe and Subutai, after pursuing Shah Muhammad, embarked on one of the most audacious military expeditions in history. The Great Raid, 1221 to 1223. With a relatively small force, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 men, they circled the Caspian Sea, a reconnaissance in force of breathtaking scope. They smashed through the Caucasus Mountains, defeated Georgian armies, routed a combined force of Kipchak Turks and Rus princes at the Kalka River, a chilling foreshadowing of the later Mongol invasion of Russia, and then looped back to rejoin Genghis Khan. They had ridden thousands of miles, fought numerous battles, and gathered priceless intelligence about the lands to the west. The eyes and ears of the Khan were truly everywhere. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during his final campaign against the Tarik Shia, but the Mongol conquests were far from over. His son and successor, Uggedi Khan, was chosen as Great Khan in 1229, and he was determined to continue his father's grand vision of world conquest. Uggedi was a more genial figure than his father, known for his generosity and fondness for drink, but he was no less ambitious. Under his reign, the Mongol war machine rolled on. The Jin dynasty in China was finally extinguished. Korea was invaded and eventually vassalized after decades of resistance. But the most dramatic expansions under Uggedi were westward. He dispatched a massive army, nominally led by Batu, Genghis Khan's grandson, son of Jokchi, but with the tactical genius Subutai as the real commander, to conquer the lands of Eastern Europe. This was the Great Mongol Invasion of Europe, 1236 to 1242. The Rus principalities, the precursors to modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, already weakened by internal divisions, were systematically conquered and devastated. Cities like Ryazan, Vladimir, and Kiev were razed, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. The Tatar yoke, as it came to be known in Russian history, would last for nearly 250 years, profoundly shaping Russian development. Then, the Mongols pushed further west into Poland and Hungary. In 1241, they delivered two crushing defeats to European armies on almost the same days. At the Battle of Liegnitz, in Poland, a Mongol detachment annihilated a combined Polish-German army led by Henry the Pious, Duke of Silesia, who was killed, his head paraded on a spear. Just 2 days later, at the Battle of Mohi on the Sijo River in Hungary, the main Mongol force under Batu and Subutai utterly destroyed the Hungarian army of King Bela IV. Europe was in a panic. It seemed nothing could stop the Devil's Horsemen. They raided into Austria, Dalmatia, Bohemia. Scouts were reportedly sighted near Vienna. Why did they stop? Just as Europe lay seemingly at their mercy in late 1241/early 1242, the Mongol armies suddenly turned back. The immediate trigger was the death of Uggedi Khan back in Karakoram. Mongol tradition dictated that all princes of the bloodline had to return to the capital to elect a new Great Khan. This probably saved Central and Western Europe from a full-scale Mongol occupation. There were other factors too. The European terrain, with more forests and fortifications, was less suited to classic Mongol cavalry tactics than the open steppes of Russia. The pastureland was less able to support the vast Mongol herds of horses. But Uggedi's death was the critical catalyst for the withdrawal. Even without conquering Western Europe, the sheer scale of what the Mongols had achieved by the mid-13th century was staggering. from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube River, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, a single empire, born from the wind-swept plains, now held sway. They had shattered old empires, created new borders, and depopulated vast regions, while simultaneously, as we saw with the Pax Mongolica, fostering unprecedented connections. They had redrawn the map of the world with the hooves of their horses and the points of their arrows. The bones of their enemies lay scattered across continents, and the silk of tribute and trade flowed towards their burgeoning imperial centers. This was empire building on a scale never before witnessed, and perhaps never since. And it all started with one man, an outcast boy, who dared to dream of uniting the world under the eternal blue sky. Chapter 8. The Ordu and the Jer life within the moving empire. We've talked about the whirlwind of conquest, the grand strategies, the rivers of blood and silk. But what was life actually like within this colossal, ever-expanding Mongol Empire? Especially for the Mongols themselves? It wasn't all just galloping across continents and collecting tribute, though that was certainly a big part of it for the warrior elite. There was a whole society, a unique way of life, that sustained this imperial endeavor. At the heart of the empire, at least in its early decades, was the Ordu or Ordo. This wasn't a city in the conventional sense, with stone walls and permanent buildings, not at first. The Ordu was the Khan's mobile court, his headquarters, his capital on the move. Imagine a vast city of gyrs, yurts, arranged in precise order, covering miles of grassland. There was the Great Khan's own enormous gyr, often white, lavishly decorated with plundered silks and gold, large enough to hold hundreds of people for feasts and councils. Around it were the gyrs of his wives and concubines. The Khans typically had many, for political alliances and progeny, his chief officials, his Kashig imperial guard, an elect, multi-ethnic force fanatically loyal to the Khan, shamans, scribes, artisans, and servants. Further out, the gyrs of lesser nobles and commanders, and surrounding it all, the vast herds of horses, sheep, and cattle that sustained this mobile metropolis. The Ordu was a logistical marvel. It could pack up and move hundreds of miles in a matter of days, following good pasture or moving with a military campaign. This mobility was a key to Mongol power. They weren't tied down to one vulnerable spot. Karakoram, founded by Ogedi around 1235, became a more permanent capital with some fixed buildings, including a palace, mosques, churches, and temples, reflecting the empire's religious diversity. But even then, the Khan and his court often preferred the traditional nomadic lifestyle, spending much of their time in mobile orders. Life in the Ordu, especially for the elite, was a mixture of steppe tradition and imperial grandeur. There were grand hunts, feasts lasting for days, with copious amounts of airag and meat, wrestling matches, archery contests, and bardic recitations of epic poems. Important decisions of state were made here, envoys from distant lands received, tribute displayed. It was the nerve center of the empire. What about the role of women? We touched on their agency in pre-imperial society. This continued, and in some ways was even amplified, within the empire. While the Khans and commanders were often away on long campaigns, it was their wives and mothers who managed the households, the herds, and sometimes even large territories or the regency of the empire itself. Mongol imperial women, especially the Khatans, queens, or consorts of high rank, could wield significant political influence. They had their own orders, their own wealth, and their own advisors. They played a crucial role in succession politics. The intrigues between different wives and their sons to secure the throne were legendary and often bloody. Think of Turijin Khatan, Ogedi's widow, who ruled the empire as regent for 5 years, 1241 to 1246, after his death, a period of considerable instability but also a demonstration of female power. Or Sogatani Beki, widow of Tolue, Genghis Khan's youngest son, who was an Nestorian Christian and a brilliant political operator. She never ruled as regent herself, but she skillfully managed her son's affairs, ensuring that all 4 of them, Monk, Kublai, Hulagu, and Erik Bug, would eventually become great Khans or powerful regional Khans. She was widely praised by contemporary chroniclers, including Persian historians, for her wisdom and administrative skills. These weren't shrinking violets. They were formidable figures who shaped the destiny of the empire. Of course, life for the common Mongol soldier or herder was far less glamorous. They were the backbone of the empire, the ones doing the fighting, tending the herds that fed the armies, and enduring the incredible hardships of constant migration and campaigning. Their lives were still tied to the rhythms of the seasons and the needs of their animals, but now also to the demands of the ever-expanding empire. Their loyalty to the Khan, cemented by the yasa and the promise of plunder and status, was crucial. They shared in the spoils of war, captured goods, livestock, sometimes even land or slaves, which was a powerful incentive. But they also bore the brunt of the casualties. Their diet remained much the same: meat and dairy. Borts, dried meat, was the MRE of its day. Harag was the ubiquitous drink. Clothing was still made from animal skins and felt, but the elite increasingly adorned themselves with luxurious silks and brocades from conquered lands. Law and order within the Mongol domains, once established, were generally strict, thanks to the yasa. We mentioned the safety of the trade routes. Within Mongol camps and controlled territories, theft and banditry were severely punished. This created a sense of internal security that was often lacking in the lands they conquered before Mongol rule. Justice was swift, often brutal, but it was generally consistent. Entertainment for the common folk, much like for the elite, revolved around traditional steppe pursuits. Wrestling, buck, was and still is a hugely popular national sport, a test of strength and skill. Archery contests, horse racing over long distances, these weren't just fun, they honed essential skills. Storytelling was vital. In a largely illiterate society, history, legends, and moral tales were passed down orally by bards and elders around the evening fire. Music, too, played a part. The haunting melodies of the morinkur, horsehead fiddle, throat singing, kumi, songs of heroism, love, and the beauty of the steppe. Religious life within the empire was remarkably diverse, as we've noted. The Khans themselves, while generally adhering to Tengrism, the worship of the eternal blue sky, were usually pragmatic about other faiths. Idkidi Khan and later Monk Khan held famous religious debates at court, inviting Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, Nestorian, and sometimes Catholic, and Taoist leaders to argue their doctrines. Not so much out of a deep spiritual quest on the Khan's part, perhaps, but more as a way to understand and manage the diverse religious communities within their empire, and maybe even to see if any faith offered particularly useful magic or blessings. Karakoram, the capital, had mosques, churches, Buddhist temples, and Taoist shrines existing side by side. This policy of relative tolerance was a key factor in the administration of such a vast and heterogeneous empire. It minimized religious conflict and allowed the Khans to draw on the talents of educated men from all faiths for their administration. For example, many scribes and financial administrators in Persia and Central Asia were Muslims, while in China, Confucian scholars, Buddhists, and Taoists were employed. The yurt remained the quintessential Mongol dwelling, even for the Khans when on the move. It was more than just a tent, it was a microcosm of the Mongol worldview. Its circular shape symbolized the sky, the cosmos. Its single central smoke hole was the connection to Tengri. The internal layout was imbued with meaning. It was a home perfectly adapted to their mobile lifestyle, a symbol of their identity. Even when they conquered cities of stone and brick, many Mongols, especially the old guard, felt more comfortable in their jurs pitched in the courtyards of palaces. However, as the empire expanded and different branches of the Mongol royal family established themselves in conquered lands, like the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, a process of sedentarization and acculturation began to take place, especially among the elite. Kublai Khan, for instance, adopted many Chinese customs, built a magnificent new capital at Dadu, Beijing, and embraced Tibetan Buddhism. The Ilkhans in Persia largely converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian art and culture. This was a slow, complex process, and it varied from region to region, but it marked a gradual shift away from the purely nomadic lifestyle of the early empire. Life within the moving empire was a dynamic interplay of tradition and adaptation. The core values of loyalty, discipline, and resilience, forged on the steppe, were what allowed them to conquer. But their pragmatism, their willingness to learn from and incorporate conquered peoples and their skills, was what allowed them to rule, at least for a time. The wind of the steppe still blew through the heart of the empire, but it was now carrying the scent of spices from the east, the philosophies of distant sages, and the administrative techniques of ancient civilizations. The bones of their ancestors provided the foundation, but the empire was now draped in the silks of a dozen cultures. Chapter 9. The cracks appear. The empire after Genghis. No empire lasts forever. Even one as vast and seemingly invincible as the Mongol Empire eventually faced the inevitable forces of entropy, internal division, and external pressures. The story of the Mongol Empire after Genghis Khan is one of continued, mind-boggling expansion for a time, followed by a slow, complex fragmentation. The colossal structure, built with such speed and force, began to develop cracks. The first major challenge, as with so many empires, was succession. Genghis Khan himself had foreseen this. He had 4 sons by his principal wife, Bort, Jochi, Chagatai, Agidi, and Tolui. Jochi, the eldest, was a capable commander, but there were always whispers about his paternity. Bort had been captured by the Merkits early in her marriage, and Jochi was born shortly after her rescue. This cast a shadow over his legitimacy for some. He died shortly before Genghis Khan. Chagatai was known as a stern disciplinarian, a strict enforcer of the yasa. Agidi, the 3rd son, was Genghis Khan's chosen successor as Great Khan. He was known for his generosity, his affability, and his ability to maintain a degree of consensus among his ambitious brothers and nephews. It was under Agidi that the empire reached perhaps its most cohesive state and launched major new campaigns. Tolui, the youngest, inherited the Mongolian heartland according to tradition. He was a skilled military commander, but died relatively young. Some say he sacrificed himself through a shamanistic ritual to save a sick Ogidi. It was Tolui's sons who would later come to dominate the imperial line. Ogidi's death in 1241, as we mentioned, halted the Mongol advance into Europe and triggered a period of instability. His widow, Turegin Khatan, ruled as regent for 5 years, a time marked by political maneuvering and corruption, as she sought to secure the succession for her own son, Kiik. Guik Khan was eventually elected Great Khan in 1246, but his reign was short and marked by tensions, particularly with Batu Khan, ruler of the westernmost part of the empire, which would become known as the Golden Horde. Guik died in 1248, possibly on his way to a confrontation with Batu, averting a major civil war at that point. The next truly effective Great Khan was Monk Khan, one of Tolui's sons, elected in 1251. Sorgatani Beki, his shrewd mother, had played a key role in his election. Monk was a capable administrator and a follower of the traditional Mongol ways. He tried to re-centralize power, reform the administration, and curb corruption. He also launched new major military campaigns. His brother Hulagu was sent to conquer the Middle East, leading to the sack of Baghdad in 1258 and the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. And another brother, Kublai, was tasked with the final conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China. It was Monk's death in 1259, during a siege in China, that precipitated the most serious crisis the empire had yet faced, the Toluid Civil War, 1260 to 1264. 2 of Monk's brothers, Kublai and Arik Bok, the youngest, who had been left in charge of the homeland, Karakoram, both declared themselves Great Khan. Kublai, based in China, had access to the vast resources and manpower of that region. He was more inclined towards Chinese ways and a more settled form of administration. Arik Bok, in Karakoram, represented the more traditionalist Mongol faction, suspicious of Kublai's Sinicization and favoring the old nomadic values. The war between them was devastating, tearing the empire apart. Kublai eventually triumphed, largely due to his superior resources. But the victory came at a cost. The authority of the Great Khan, while still nominally recognized, was severely weakened. By the time Kublai Khan established himself as Great Khan, the Mongol Empire was already, in practical terms, beginning to function as 4 largely independent successor states, or khanates. 1. The Yuan dynasty, China and Mongolia. Founded by Kublai Khan, this was the domain of the Great Khan. Kublai moved his capital from Karakoram to Dadu, modern Beijing. embracing Chinese dynastic traditions while still trying to maintain Mongol distinctiveness. This was the wealthiest and most populous of the Khanates. 2. The Ilkhanate, Persia, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, founded by Hulagu Khan. The Ilkhans, subordinate Khans, ruled over a sophisticated, ancient Islamic civilization. They eventually converted to Islam and became significant patrons of Persian art, science, and culture, though their rule was often marked by internal strife and struggles with neighboring powers like the Mamluks of Egypt, who famously defeated a Mongol army at Ain Jalut in 1260, marking one of the first major setbacks for Mongol expansion. 3. The Golden Horde, Russia, parts of Eastern Europe, Western Siberia, founded by Batu Khan. The Golden Horde, based on the Volga River, dominated the Rus principalities for centuries, extracting tribute and influencing their political development. They remained largely nomadic for a longer period than the other Khanates and eventually converted to Islam. 4. The Chagatai Khanate, Central Asia, Transoxiana, parts of modern Xinjiang, named after Genghis Khan's second son, Chagatai. This Khanate was perhaps the most staunchly traditionalist and resistant to sedentarization for a long time, remaining a stronghold of nomadic Mongol culture and often clashing with its more settled neighbors, the Yuan and the Ilkhanate. While these Khanates still acknowledged the Great Khan in Daju as their nominal overlord, at least for a while, they increasingly acted as independent states, pursuing their own policies, sometimes even warring against each other. The vast distances, differing local conditions, and the ambitions of regional rulers made true centralized control impossible. Several factors contributed to this fragmentation and eventual decline. Sheer size and diversity. The empire was just too big, too diverse culturally and geographically to be ruled effectively by one central authority, especially with pre-modern communication and transport technologies. Assimilation. As Mongol elites settled in conquered lands, they gradually adopted the customs, languages, and religions of the local populations. In China, they became more Chinese, in Persia, more Persian. This diluted their distinct Mongol identity and military ethos. The wind of the steppe began to be absorbed by the earth of sedentary civilizations. Succession disputes. The lack of a clear, consistently applied system of succession, like primogeniture, led to constant infighting among Genghis Khan's descendants every time a powerful ruler died. These internal power struggles drained resources and weakened the empire. Decline of nomadic military advantage. Over time, sedentary societies developed better defenses and new military technologies, particularly gunpowder weapons, ironically, a technology the Mongols helped spread. The traditional Mongol advantages of cavalry and archery, while still formidable, became less decisive. Internal corruption and decadence. In some Khanates, particularly later in their existence, the ruling class became more interested in luxury and courtly pleasures than in maintaining the harsh discipline and martial vigor of their ancestors. The Yasa was less strictly enforced. The Black Death. The plague, which swept through Asia and Europe in the mid-14th century, had a devastating impact on the Mongol Khanates as well. It disrupted trade, depopulated regions, and weakened state structures. The very interconnectedness the Mongols had fostered became a conduit for their own demographic and economic decline. By the mid-14th century, the cracks had become gaping fissures. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown by the native Ming dynasty in 1368. The Ilkhanate in Persia had already disintegrated into smaller successor states. The Golden Horde began to break apart into smaller Tatar Khanates, which were gradually absorbed by the rising power of Muscovy Russia. The Chagatai Khanate also fragmented. The empire that Genghis Khan had built with such astonishing speed and ferocity had, within a century and a half of his death, effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The wind had scattered. The bones were being reclaimed by local earth. The silk trade continued, but no longer under the singular dominion of a Mongol Great Khan. The great blue wolf had sired many pups, but they had grown into regional powers, often snarling at each other, forgetting the unity their ancestor had imposed. Chapter 10. Whispers on the Wind. Why the silence? The legacy of the steppe. So we come back to one of our original questions. Why has this colossal empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, often slipped into the footnotes of Western popular consciousness? Why the relative silence in many school textbooks, especially when compared to, say, the Romans or the ancient Egyptians? It's a fascinating puzzle, and the answers are as complex as the empire itself. One major factor is the nature of Mongol material legacy. Think about the iconic symbols of other great empires. Rome gave us the Colosseum, aqueducts, paved roads, and Latin. Egypt left behind the pyramids, Karnak, hieroglyphs. Greece gifted us the Parthenon and the foundations of Western philosophy. These are tangible, monumental remnants that scream great civilization. The Mongols, especially in their early formative period, were nomadic. Their capital, Karakorum, while impressive for its time with its blend of cultures, never achieved the monumental permanence of a Rome or a Constantinople. Their greatest monuments were not buildings, but rather the vastness of their conquests, the fear they inspired, and the radical reordering of the political map. Their cities were often mobile camps of guerres. Their records, like the secret history, while invaluable, were internal chronicles, not grand public inscriptions designed for posterity in the same way. When their empire fragmented and their power waned in places like China and Persia, the successor states often sought to build their own monumental legacies, sometimes even deliberately erasing or downplaying the Mongol period. The wind, by its nature, leaves fewer stone footprints than a settled empire. This ties into deliberate erasure and narrative reframing by successor states. When the Ming dynasty overthrew the Yuan in China, they portrayed the Mongols as foreign barbarians and emphasized the restoration of native Chinese rule. In Russia, the Tatar yoke was remembered as a period of oppression and humiliation, a dark chapter to be overcome. Persian chroniclers, while often admiring Mongol military prowess, also detailed their destructive impact on Islamic civilization. The story of the Mongols was often written by those they conquered, and history, as they say, is often written by the victors, or, in this case, those who eventually became victors over Mongol successor states. Their narrative tended to focus on the barbarian destructiveness rather than the Pax Mongolica interconnectedness or the administrative innovations. Then there's the fragmentation itself, because the empire broke into several distinct khanates, each with its own trajectory and eventual decline. It didn't leave behind a single, easily identifiable Mongol empire in the same way the Roman Empire, even in its decline, left a clear geographical and cultural imprint on Europe. Its legacy became diffuse, absorbed into the histories of China, Russia, Persia, and Central Asia. A significant element, particularly in older Western historiography, was a Eurocentric bias. The Mongol impact on Eastern Europe was certainly noted and feared, but the heart of the Mongol Empire and its most profound long-term transformations were in Asia. Western historical narratives traditionally focused more on events directly impacting Western Europe, so the rise and fall of an empire centered on the Asian steppes might have received proportionally less attention. Moreover, the image of the Mongols in Europe was overwhelmingly negative: the barbarian horde, the devil's horsemen. This image, born of fear and conflict, was slow to be nuanced. However, to say they simply disappeared is, of course, an overstatement. Their legacy is profound, even if it's sometimes hidden in plain sight. Genetic legacy. Modern genetic studies have famously identified a Y chromosome lineage believed to have originated with Genghis Khan or his close male relatives that is now found in a significant percentage of men across a vast swath of Asia, from the Pacific to the Caspian. This is a stark biological testament to the reach and impact of the Khan and his descendants. The bones of the empire live on in the DNA of millions, reshaping trade and geopolitics. The Mongols didn't just use the Silk Road, they fundamentally reoriented it, and in doing so, reshaped global economic and political dynamics for centuries. They were a key catalyst in connecting East and West. Even after their empire fell, the routes they secured and the connections they fostered had lasting consequences. Some historians argue that the Mongol disruption of traditional Middle Eastern trade routes inadvertently spurred Europeans to seek maritime routes to Asia, contributing to the Age of Discovery. Military innovations, Mongol tactics, particularly the use of combined arms, cavalry, archery, siegecraft, psychological warfare, and swift maneuver, influenced military thinking long after their armies faded. The spread of gunpowder technology, accelerated by the Mongols, had obvious, world-changing military consequences. The idea of a unified Eurasia. For a brief period, the Mongols demonstrated that it was possible to unite a vast portion of the Eurasian landmass under a single rule. This idea, however brutal its implementation, resonated in later attempts at empire building and in concepts of transcontinental interaction. Cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. We've discussed the flow of ideas, technologies, arts, and religions during the Pax Mongolica. This cross-pollination enriched cultures from China to Europe, even if the carriers of this exchange were often feared. National identity for modern Mongolia. For the modern nation of Mongolia, Genghis Khan is not a forgotten barbarian. He is the founding father, a symbol of national pride, unity, and past glory. After decades of Soviet influence, which often downplayed his significance, Mongolia has reclaimed Genghis Khan as its central historical figure. His image is everywhere, on currency, statues, product branding. His story is a source of inspiration as Mongolia navigates its place in the 21st century world, a landlocked democracy rich in resources, but facing many challenges. So, the silence isn't total. It's more like whispers on the wind, echoes in the grass. You have to listen carefully, look beyond the obvious monuments, and piece together a story that was deliberately muted in some quarters and simply too vast and complex to be easily summarized in others. The Mongol Empire may not have left behind pyramids or marble temples in the same way as other civilizations, but its impact is written into the genetic code of continents, the history of warfare, the patterns of global trade, and the enduring spirit of the people who still call the high steppes home. Their legacy is not in stone, but in the wind that still sweeps across those immense plains, carrying tales of a time when the children of the eternal blue sky ruled the world. Conclusion: the wind remembers. And so, our journey across the vast, wind-swept plains of history into the heart of the Mongol Empire draws to a close. We began with a question: how could such an immense power emerge from such a harsh land, and why has its story often felt like a half-forgotten dream? We've seen how the unforgiving steppe itself, the wind and bones, forged a people of unparalleled resilience and adaptability. We've traced the meteoric rise of Temujin, the outcast boy who became Genghis Khan, a leader who transformed scattered, feuding tribes into a disciplined nation and an unstoppable military force. We've marveled at their art of war, a symphony of hooves, arrows, and terrifying strategy that brought empires to their knees from Beijing to Budapest. But we also uncovered the paradox of the Pax Mongolica, how these brutal conquerors became the unlikely guardians of the Silk Road, fostering an era of unprecedented trade, communication, and cultural exchange. The silk of commerce and ideas flowed freely, even as it carried the seeds of plague. We've walked through the mobile cities of Gurs, glimpsed the surprising power of Mongol women, and felt the spiritual undertones of Tengrism that guided their destiny. And then, the inevitable cracks. The strains of succession, the sheer unmanageable scale of their dominion, the slow assimilation into the cultures they conquered, leading to the fragmentation of Genghis Khan's colossal creation into successor khanates, each with its own fate. We've pondered why their monumental story sometimes feels muted, a consequence of their nomadic nature, the narratives of their successors, and perhaps our own biases in how we remember the past. But the wind, as we said at the beginning, has a long memory. It remembers the thunder of a million hooves. It whispers the names of khans and khatans, of forgotten battles and bustling caravan cities. It carries the scent of distant campfires and the echo of songs sung under a vast starlit sky. The story of Mongolia and its empire is more than just a chronicle of conquest. It's a testament to human adaptability in the face of extreme adversity. It's a study in leadership, both brilliant and brutal. It's a stark reminder of the cyclical nature of power, how quickly empires can rise, how complexly they can fall, and it challenges us to look beyond the traditional centers of civilization to understand the profound impact that peoples from the so-called peripheries can have on the course of world history. The Mongols may not have left behind towering stone edifices to mark their passage, but their empire was an earthquake that reconfigured the landscape of an entire continent. Its tremors are still felt today, in the genetic makeup of nations, in the routes of trade and ideas, and in the enduring spirit of a people who once held the world in their grasp, guided by the wind, built on bones, and connected by silk. So, the next time you look at a map of Asia, or hear a whisper of Genghis Khan, perhaps you'll see more than just a vast space or a half-legendary conqueror. Perhaps you'll hear the wind carrying its own story, a story of an empire unlike any other. And perhaps you'll ask yourself, what other great stories, what other empires of wind are still out there, waiting for us to listen closely enough to hear their tales above the noise of our modern world? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you've enjoyed this exploration into the heart of Mongolia's wild history, well, you know what to do. Keep questioning, keep exploring, because history is full of surprises, often hiding just behind those swinging doors of perception, or in the silent language of the wind. Okay, settle back down. I see that look in your eyes. The story can't end there, can it? We've seen the meteoric rise, the earth-shattering conquests, the golden age of the Pax Mongolica, and the inevitable cracks that led to fragmentation. But what happened after the great umbrella of the unified Mongol Empire collapsed? What became of the Mongol heartland itself, the cradle of Genghis Khan? Did the wind simply sweep away all traces, leaving only silent steps and fading legends? Not by a long shot. The Mongols didn't just pack up their gears and ride off into the historical sunset. The story of what came next is perhaps less bombastic, less filled with continent-spanning campaigns, but it's no less fascinating, and in many ways, it's even more crucial to understanding the Mongolia of today. It's a story of resilience, of adaptation, of holding onto an identity against overwhelming odds. This is the long shadow of the empire, the slow burn of centuries that followed the blaze. Chapter 11. The retreat to the Grass Sea, the Northern Yuan and the echoes of empire. Imagine the scene, 1368. The Yuan dynasty, Kublai Khan's magnificent creation in China, has crumbled. The native Chinese Ming dynasty, fueled by peasant rebellions and a desire to oust the foreign rulers, has seized power. Token Tenma, the last Yuan emperor, flees Dadu, Beijing, with his court, his remaining loyalists, and the imperial seals. Where does he go? He goes home, back to the vast, familiar grasslands of Mongolia. This wasn't the end of the Mongols as a political force, not immediately. They didn't just dissolve into scattered tribes overnight. What was established was the Northern Yuan dynasty. From their heartland, they still claimed the legitimacy of the Great Khan, still saw themselves as the rightful rulers of China, and by extension, the Mongol world. The dream of reconquering China, of restoring their lost glory, would flicker for generations, leading to decades, even centuries, of border conflicts with the powerful Ming dynasty. The Ming, for their part, weren't content to simply see the Mongols retreat. They launched punitive expeditions deep into Mongolia, seeking to shatter any possibility of a Mongol resurgence. They'd even managed to capture Karakoram, the old imperial capital, and raze it again. The Ming built and reinforced fortifications, what we now often associate with the Great Wall, not just to keep the Mongols out, but to project power and define a border. Life for the Mongols of the Northern Yuan was a far cry from the days of Genghis or Kublai. The vast resources of China were gone. The unified empire was a memory. Power became more decentralized. The Great Khan of the Northern Yuan often struggled to assert his authority over increasingly independent and powerful chieftains. Old tribal rivalries, suppressed under the iron fist of Genghis and his immediate successors, began to resurface. Remember those pre-imperial days of feuding clans? History began to rhyme. Two major groups emerged as dominant forces on the steppe. The Eastern Mongols, the Khakas being a prominent group, descendants of Genghis Khan's core lineage, and the Western Mongols, the Oirats, a powerful confederation who were not direct Chinggisids, but often intermarried and fiercely competed for power. The relationship between these groups was complex and often violent. Sometimes they allied against the Ming. Other times, they'd fought bitterly amongst themselves for supremacy over the Mongolian plateau. Figures like Isan Taishi of the Oirats rose to prominence in the mid-15th century. He was a brilliant military leader who managed to unify large parts of Mongolia, inflict a devastating defeat on the Ming army at the Tumu crisis, even capturing the Ming Emperor Zhengtong, and briefly seemed poised to restore Mongol imperial might. But his power was personal. After his assassination, his confederation fractured. Later, Dayan Khan, a Chinggisid, managed to reunite many of the eastern Mongol tribes in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, reasserting the authority of the Genghis Khan lineage and trying to re-establish a more centralized state. His grandson, Altan Khan of the Timurid, became another powerful figure, raiding deep into Ming territory and even besieging Beijing. So, the spirit of the warrior steppe was far from extinguished. But these were regional powers, not world-conquering empires. They were fighting for survival, for pasture lands, for control of trade routes that still trickled across the Gobi, and against the ever-present pressure from the Ming. The Empire of Wind had shrunk back to the wind of its homeland, but that wind still had teeth. One of the most profound transformations during this post-imperial period, and one that would shape Mongolian identity for centuries to come, was the second conversion to Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism had made inroads into Mongolia during the imperial era, particularly under Kublai Khan, who favored the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism. But with the fall of the Yuan and the retreat to the steppe, its influence waned among many Mongol groups. Then, in the late 16th century, a renewed wave of conversion began, largely driven by figures like Altan Khan. He saw in Tibetan Buddhism not just a spiritual path, but also a potential source of legitimacy and a unifying cultural force that could transcend tribal divisions. He forged a powerful alliance with Sonam Gyatso, a prominent Tibetan Lama of the Gelug school, the Yellow Hat school. It was Altan Khan who first bestowed the title Dalai Lama, Ocean of Wisdom, upon Sonam Gyatso, a title that would become synonymous with the spiritual and temporal leadership of Tibet. In return, Sonam Gyatso recognized Altan Khan as a reincarnation of Kublai Khan and a protector of the faith. This mutual endorsement was politically potent. Tibetan Buddhism, particularly the Gelug school, spread rapidly among the Mongol nobility and then to the common people. Monasteries were built across Mongolia, becoming centers of learning, art, medicine, and, crucially, political and economic power. This conversion had deep and lasting consequences. Cultural transformation. It introduced literacy, using the Tibetan script for religious texts, sophisticated philosophy, a rich artistic tradition, thankas, sculptures, and new social customs. Pacifying influence, to some extent. Buddhist emphasis on non-violence and compassion, while not entirely erasing the Mongols' martial traditions, did gradually temper some of the intertribal warfare. Resources that might have gone into raiding were increasingly diverted to supporting the growing monastic establishment. The rise of a theocratic element. A unique institution, the Jetsun Damba Kutuktu, emerged as the spiritual head of Buddhism for the Khalkha Mongols, akin to the Dalai Lama's role in Tibet. These reincarnate lamas became immensely powerful figures, often wielding significant political influence alongside secular nobles. The line of Jetsun Damba Kutuktus would play a key role in Mongolia's path to independence in the 20th century. Shift in identity. Being Mongol increasingly became intertwined with being a follower of Tibetan Buddhism. This provided a powerful cultural glue in a politically fragmented era. However, this internal transformation was happening against a backdrop of ominous external developments. To the northeast, a new power was rising, the Manchus. Like the Mongols, the Manchus were a nomadic people from the periphery of China. They too were skilled horsemen and archers, and they had their own imperial ambitions. By the early 17th century, the Manchus, under leaders like Nuhasi and Hongtaiji, were consolidating their power, uniting various Jurchen tribes, from whom the Jin dynasty, Genghis Khan's old foes, had sprung. They learned from Mongol military organization and even adopted a script based on the Mongol alphabet. They also skillfully exploited the divisions among the Mongol tribes, forming alliances with some against others. The southern Mongols, in what is now Inner Mongolia, were the first to fall under Manchu influence, then direct rule. The Khalkha Mongols of Outer Mongolia found themselves squeezed between the expanding Manchu Qing dynasty to the south and east, and the rising Tsarist Russian Empire encroaching from the north and west, hungry for furs and territory in Siberia. The final act in this chapter of waning independence came in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The Oirat Mongols, particularly the Dzunga Khanate led by figures like Galdan Boshucha Khan, made a last, powerful bid for a unified Mongol state, challenging both the Manchus and the Khakas. Galdan was a formidable leader, deeply influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, but also a skilled military commander. His campaigns caused panic in both Beijing and among the Khalkha nobles. Faced with the Dzunga threat, and with Manchu power growing irresistible, the Khalkha Mongol nobles made a fateful decision. At a great assembly at Dolan Nur in 1691, they formally submitted to the Manchu Kangxi Emperor, seeking protection from the Dzungas in exchange for becoming vassals of the Qing dynasty. The Dzunga Khanate itself was eventually, and brutally, crushed by the Qing in the mid-18th century after decades of warfare, a campaign that some historians described as genocidal. And so, by the mid-18th century, virtually all of what we consider historical Mongolia was incorporated into the Qing Empire. The descendants of Genghis Khan, the conquerors of the world, were now subjects. The Empire of Wind had been tamed, at least politically, by another imperial power, itself originating from the nomadic fringes. The Manchu Qing dynasty would rule Mongolia for over 2 centuries. This period of Qing rule, while bringing a degree of stability and ending much of the inter-Mongol warfare, also led to social and economic changes that further marginalized many Mongols and saw increasing Han-Chinese settlement and commercial penetration in some areas. This era, from the fall of the Yuan to the consolidation of Qing rule, is crucial. It's the period when the global empire receded, but the Mongol identity was reshaped by internal dynamics and new cultural forces like Tibetan Buddhism, even as external pressures mounted. The silence about Mongolia in some world histories is partly because, during these centuries, their story became more localized, a struggle for autonomy and cultural survival rather than global conquest. But the embers of that imperial fire, the memory of Genghis Khan and the dream of independence, never truly died. They smoldered under the surface, waiting for the winds of the 20th century to fan them once more into a flame, however fragile. The bones of their ancestors were still there, buried under the steppe, and the silk was now largely the saffron robes of lamers and the tribute paid to a foreign emperor. But the story, as always, was not over. Chapter 12. The Sleeping Giant Awakens. Echoes and Rebirth in the Modern Era. The Qing dynasty, like all dynasties, eventually began to weaken. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it was beset by internal rebellions, foreign encroachment, and a general sense of decay. For Mongolia, which had been under Manchu rule for over 2 centuries, this period of Qing decline offered a sliver of opportunity, a chance to reassert an identity that had been suppressed but never extinguished. The sleeping giant of Mongol nationalism, nourished by memories of Genghis Khan's empire and the unique cultural synthesis of Tibetan Buddhism and steppe tradition, began to stir. What was life like under Qing rule for those 2 centuries? It was complex. The Qing emperors, being Manchu and not Han Chinese, initially had a somewhat different relationship with the Mongols than they did with their Han subjects. They recognized the Mongols' martial heritage and sought to use them as a buffer against Russian expansion and to maintain stability on the vast northern frontiers. Mongol nobles were incorporated into the Qing banner system, a military administrative structure. The Qing patronized Tibetan Buddhism, understanding its importance in Mongol society, and the Jepsen Damba Kutuktu of Urga, modern Ulaanbaatar, remained a highly influential figure. However, Qing rule also brought significant changes that were not always beneficial. Economic hardship. Chinese merchants and moneylenders increasingly penetrated Mongolia, often trapping herders in cycles of debt. Pasturlands were sometimes encroached upon by Han Chinese settlers, especially in Inner Mongolia. Social stratification. The gap between the wealthy nobility and lamist hierarchy on one hand and the impoverished common herders on another often widened. Loss of autonomy. While Mongol traditional structures were maintained to some extent, ultimate authority rested with the king officials, ambans, and Beijing. The Mongols were subjects, not masters in their own land. Pacification's price. The long peace under king rule, combined with the immense resources poured into the monastic establishment, a significant portion of the male population became lamas, committed to celibacy, arguably led to a demographic stagnation and a decline in the old martial Dionism. But the memory of independence was a powerful undercurrent. As the king edifice began to crumble in the early 1900s, Mongol nobles and high lamas started to look for ways to break free. The Xinhai Revolution in China in 1911, which overthrew the Qing dynasty and established the Republic of China, provided the catalyst. Sensing their moment, the Mongol nobles of Outer Mongolia, Khalkha Mongolia, declared independence from China in December 1911. They proclaimed the 8th Jepsendamba Kutuktu as the Bogd Khan, or holy ruler, creating an independent theocratic monarchy. This was a remarkable moment, the first taste of self-rule after more than 2 centuries. However, this newfound independence was fragile. The new Republic of China did not recognize Mongolia's independence and considered it part of Chinese territory. Tsarist Russia, while supporting a degree of Mongolian autonomy to create a buffer state against China, was not keen on a fully independent and potentially powerful Mongolia. The period from 1911 to 1921 was incredibly turbulent. Struggle for recognition. The Bogd Khanate fought for international recognition, which largely failed to materialize. Chinese occupation. In 1919, taking advantage of the chaos of the Russian Revolution, Chinese warlord forces occupied Mongolia and revoked its autonomy. The Mat Baron's mayhem. Then came one of the most bizarre episodes. Baron Roman von Ungern Sternberg, a renegade white Russian general, an eccentric and brutal mystic, invaded Mongolia in 1920 to 1921 with a motley army. He drove out the Chinese, briefly restored the Bogd Khan to power, though Ungern was the real power, and unleashed a reign of terror, particularly against Chinese and Jews in Uyghur. He dreamed of creating a vast new Buddhist monarchist empire. Ungern's bloody escapade was short-lived. It inadvertently created an opening for another force, Mongolian revolutionaries, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia and seeking a more radical path to national liberation and social reform. Figures like Damdin Sukh-Bata and Khorlugin Choibalsan emerged as leaders. With Soviet Red Army assistance, these Mongolian partisans defeated Ungern's forces and then pushed out the remaining Chinese troops. In July 1921, a new revolutionary government was established, initially as a limited constitutional monarchy with the Bogd Khan as a figurehead. But after the Bogd Khan's death in 1924, the Mongolian People's Republic, MPR, was proclaimed the second communist state in the world after the Soviet Union. This marked a profound turning point. For the next nearly 70 years, Mongolia would be a Soviet satellite state, closely aligned with Moscow politically, economically, and ideologically. This era brought modernization, Soviet style. Significant strides were made in areas like literacy, healthcare, and industrialization, albeit limited. Ulaanbaatar transformed from a largely monastic town into a modern city. Collectivization. The traditional nomadic herding economy was forcibly collectivized, with often disastrous initial results, disrupting age-old ways of life. Political purges. Under leaders like Choibalsan, who became Mongolia's Stalin, the MPR experienced brutal political purges in the 1930s, mirroring those in the USSR. Thousands of lamas, intellectuals, nobles, and political opponents were executed or imprisoned. The monastic establishment was largely destroyed, its wealth confiscated. This was a traumatic assault on Mongolia's traditional culture. Suppression of national identity in some ways. While promoting a secular, socialist identity, the Soviet era often downplayed or distorted pre-revolutionary Mongolian history, particularly the legacy of Genghis Khan, who was sometimes portrayed as a feudal reactionary. The traditional Mongol script was replaced with a Cyrillic-based alphabet. Isolation. Mongolia became largely isolated from the non-communist world, its foreign policy dictated by Moscow. Yet, even during this period of intense Soviet influence, a sense of distinct Mongolian identity persisted. The nomadic heritage, though altered, didn't disappear. The language remained, and the memory of a greater past, however suppressed, lingered. Then, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Soviet Union itself began to unravel under Gorbachev's reforms of glasnost and perestroika, winds of change swept through Mongolia once more. A peaceful democratic revolution in 1990 led to the end of one-party rule. Mongolia embraced multi-party democracy and a market economy, a remarkable and largely bloodless transition. The post-1990 era has been one of rediscovery and redefinition for Mongolia. Reclaiming history. Genghis Khan has been fully rehabilitated and embraced as the nation's founding father and a potent symbol of national pride. His image is ubiquitous. There's a renewed interest in traditional Mongolian script, culture, and pre-socialist history. Revival of religion. Tibetan Buddhism has seen a significant revival, with monasteries being rebuilt and religious freedom restored. Navigating geopolitics. Mongolia today maintains a delicate balancing act, pursuing a third neighbor policy to foster relations with countries beyond its two giant neighbors, Russia and China, seeking to safeguard its independence and sovereignty. Economic challenges and opportunities. The transition to a market economy has brought both opportunities, especially with Mongolia's vast mineral wealth, coal, copper, gold, and challenges, poverty, inequality, environmental concerns. Maintaining nomadic heritage. About a third of Mongolians still maintain a semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyle, a living link to their ancient heritage, though this way of life faces pressures from modernization and climate change. The Mongolia of the 21st century is a land of contrasts. Ancient traditions coexisting with modern aspirations, vast empty landscapes dotted with bustling mining towns, a fierce pride in its imperial past fueling a democratic future. The empire of wind, bones, and silk is no more, but its echoes resonate powerfully in the identity, challenges, and dreams of the modern Mongolian nation. The wind still sweeps across the steppe, but now it carries new whispers of democracy, of global engagement, and of a nation determined to write its own next chapter, firmly rooted in the legacy of its extraordinary past. The sleeping giant, awakened, is now finding its voice in a very different world. And that surely is a story worth continuing to watch. Write me a story on this raft with Chapter 13, Between Heaven and Earth, Mongolia at the Crossroads of the Ages. Imagine modern Ulaanbaatar. Here, glass skyscrapers, symbols of the new economic boom, are juxtaposed with traditional yurts still scattered around the outskirts of the city. Luxury SUVs share the roads with riders going about their business. In trendy coffee shops, young Mongolians dressed in the latest Western fashions discuss startups and global trends, but once outside the city, they can just as easily saddle up and rule the herds as their ancestors did hundreds of years ago. This is not just a contrast, it is the essence of modern Mongolia, where the past is not a museum piece, but a living part of the present. The third neighbor policy we mentioned is not just a diplomatic strategy, it is a daily act of equilibrium. Mongolia is actively developing relations with the United States, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, India. It participates in UN peacekeeping missions, conducts international exercises like the famous Conquest, positioning itself as a responsible and open member of the global community. This is an attempt not just to find allies, but to diversify its ties so as not to be totally dependent on its powerful neighbors. It's a modern manifestation of the same steppe dodginess and ability to find unexpected ways that once helped their ancestors build an empire. And culture. Oh, the culture of modern Mongolia is a separate song. Yes, Genghis Khan is everywhere. But behind his giant shadow blossoms an amazing art. Mongolian rock bands like the Hu, mixing traditional throat singing and morinhur with heavy guitar riffs, are conquering the world charts. Their music isn't just exotic, it's a powerful statement that ancient traditions can be incredibly relevant and full of energy. Young artists are reinterpreting nomadic heritage in contemporary installations. Filmmakers are making films that are winning prizes at international festivals, telling stories of both a great past and a challenging present. It's not just a revival, it's a creative explosion where the bone of tradition takes on the new silk flesh of modernity. But of course, not everything is so rosy. Huge mineral reserves, coal, copper, gold, rare earth metals, are both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it is a chance for economic prosperity. On the other hand, there is the risk of a resource curse, corruption, social inequality, environmental problems, and a threat to traditional nomadic ways of life due to the expansion of mining operations. How to find a balance between economic development and preservation of unique nature and culture? This question faces Mongolia as acutely as the choice between nomadism and sedentarization once did. And the climate. The same harsh nature that forged the Mongolian character is now posing new challenges. Climate change is particularly acute here. Harsher winters, duds, drier summers, desertification. This is a direct threat to pastoralism, the very basis of nomadic civilization. Mongolians, who have lived in harmony with nature for centuries, are now forced to adapt to its rapid and not always predictable changes, to seek new ways of sustainable development. So what is next? Where does this wind of change carry the hairs of Genghis Khan? One thing is certain. The spirit of the steppe, the spirit of freedom and incredible resilience, has not died out in them. They look into the future with open eyes, with pride for their past, but without the desire to simply copy it. They are building their democracy, their economy, their culture, not always smoothly, with mistakes and arguments, but they are building. And perhaps the most important part of their legacy is not just the memories of conquest, but this very ability to adapt, survive, and rebuild. The ability to look out at the vast horizon and see not emptiness but possibility. The ability to hear in the whisper of the wind not only the voices of ancestors, but also the call of the future. Mongolia today is not just a dot on the map. It is a living laboratory of history, where ancient nomadic instincts face the challenges of globalization. It is a country that proves that even the most savage civilization has more to offer the world than just exotic landscapes or legends of warriors. It offers a lesson in resilience, a lesson in the ability to change while staying true to one's essence. And as long as the wind walks across its vast steppes, the story of Mongolia, a story of wind, bone, and silk, will continue, surprising and inspiring those willing to listen. And who knows what other unexpected twists and turns await us beyond the next hill, beyond the next curve of this ancient and eternally young land? The wind remembers, and it has not told us everything yet. Chapter 14. The soul of the steppe in the Wi-Fi era, in search of new harmony. Look into the eyes of a young Mongolian programmer in Ulaanbaatar who, after work, sits down not to play a computer game, but to study ancient texts in Todo-Bichig, Old Mongolian script. Or observe a family of herders who, while using solar panels to charge their smartphones and GPS to track their herds, still make offerings to the spirits of the mountains and rivers before beginning their nomadic journey. It's not just preserving tradition for tradition's sake. It is a deep, almost instinctive need to combine the bone of the ancestors with the silk of modernity without losing oneself. Education plays a huge role in this. Mongolia invests heavily in the education of its citizens, sending young people to study at the best universities in the world. But at the same time, there is a reverse process, revival of interest in its own history, language, and philosophy. New museums are being opened, monasteries are being restored, and festivals of traditional culture are being held. This is not just nostalgia, it is a search for roots that can provide a foothold in a rapidly changing world. Knowing English or Chinese is important, but knowing who you are and where you come from is perhaps even more important. And religion. The revitalized Tibetan Buddhism is not just about restored temples and monastic communities. For many Mongolians, it has once again become a living spiritual practice, a source of moral guidance and solace. Shamanism, an ancient belief in nature spirits, is also experiencing a renaissance, especially in rural areas. Sometimes these two traditions are intricately intertwined, creating a unique Mongolian syncretism. People are looking for a spiritual anchor that resonates with their deepest sense of the world, with a sense of the sacredness of the land on which they live. It is an attempt to hear the voice of Tengri, the eternal blue sky, not only in ancient legends, but also in the noise of the modern city. Of course, there are also challenges to identity. Globalization brings with it not only opportunities, but also the threat of cultural unification. How to preserve the unique Mongolian way of life when world brands, mass culture, foreign languages are coming from all sides. How not to dissolve, not to become just another sales market. This question worries many people, from intellectuals to simple shepherds, and the answer seems to lie in the very ability to adapt that Mongols have demonstrated over the centuries, to take the best from outside, but to melt it in the crucible of their own culture, giving it a Mongolian flavor. Look at Mongolian wrestling, bogok. It's more than a sport. It's a ritual, it's a philosophy, it's the epitome of strength, agility, and respect for your opponent. When wrestlers go to the fight, performing the dance of the eagle, they are not just warming up. They connect with the spirit of the ancestors, with the energy of the steppe. And when thousands of people watch with bated breath the fights in the stadium during Naadam, it is not just entertainment, it is an act of national unity. One Naadam itself is the three men's games: wrestling, archery, horse racing. It is not just an annual celebration. It is a living thread linking modern Mongolia to the era of Genghis Khan. It is a moment when the entire nation seems to return to its roots, celebrating the qualities that allowed it to survive and thrive: strength, marksmanship, endurance, and, of course, an unbreakable bond with the horse. Little boys and girls riding their stunted but incredibly hardy steeds across the vast steppe are not just competitors. They are the future of Mongolia, rushing towards their destiny with the same courage as their ancestors. So what is Mongolia today? It is a country that is desperately trying to find a new harmony, a harmony between its glorious but difficult past and an uncertain but full of possibilities future. Harmony between ancient traditions and modern technology. Harmony between the need for economic growth and preservation of the fragile ecosystem of the steppe. Harmony between national pride and the need to be part of the global world. This is not an easy path full of traps and temptations, but if anyone is able to walk it, it is the hands of those who once built the largest empire on earth, relying only on wind, bone, and silk. Their history is not a frozen monument, but an ongoing epic, and each new day, each new challenge, each new achievement is another line inscribed in this great book of the steppe. And now, my friend, I think we can let this gust of wind subside. But remember, the story of Mongolia does not end here. It continues right now, in every beat of a nomad's heart, in every click of a programmer's mouse, in every neigh of a horse rushing across the vast expanse. And who knows, maybe one day the wind will bring us new chapters of this amazing saga. But for now, listen to the wind. It always remembers, and it is always ready to tell you more.